I spent nearly 3 years working overnight at a fast food restaurant. As a drive-through attendant, my college class schedule was unusual and only part-time. Working overnight made it much easier for me to get my schoolwork done during the day. Most of my shifts will be slow and uneventful. However, strange things did happen from time to time. My manager always tried to schedule 2 people overnight, but there were times when we had to spend the night alone. Fortunately, most of the strange things happened with my coworker present, but this one time, I wasn't so fortunate. My main coworker who worked overnights with me was taking a vacation week, so I was alone for 3 of the 5 night shifts that week. My first 2 nights went as usual, without incident. It was slow, and all the drive-through orders were small and straightforward. On the 3rd night, things started slowly, with only 5 to 10 customers arriving every hour to order a small snack or a drink. Then, around 2 a.m., there was a nearly 45-minute period during which no one showed up. I kept my headset on in case someone pulled into the drive-through, but I decided to start cleaning while I had some free time. There wasn't much else to do, so cleaning became my way of passing the time. I'm not sure how long I was cleaning because I was never interrupted, but I passed by the front counter once and noticed bright headlights shining through the store's front window. The car was parked directly outside the doors. Our restaurant's dining room closed at 9 p.m. every night, leaving only the drive-through open, so it was strange that someone was parked there. But of course I didn't think much of it because they could have just parked and looked up directions on their iPhone or something. So I continued my cleaning. A few minutes later, my headset beeped, indicating that a customer was in the drive-through lane. I quickly approached the window and inquired as to how I could. A man spoke softly and asked for a large soda. I instructed him to pull forward and pour his fountain drink as usual. The guy drove up quickly, so I was still pouring the drink, but I noticed in the corner of my eye that he was looking in. Window in the restaurant. Some people did this, but I've never understood why, because it makes things awkward. But I finished up and handed him his drink. He gave me the exact change, and I thanked him before stepping away to continue cleaning. I wiped down a few counters and reorganized a small shelf, but as I walked past the window, I jumped back a little because the man was still there, looking at me. "Did you need anything else, sir?" He didn't respond for a moment, not even to my question, before saying no and driving away. The guy must have been sitting there looking in the window for 5 minutes while I was cleaning, which was creepy and strange, but I knew the restaurant's doors were locked, so I felt somewhat safe. I kept my headset on and proceeded to wipe down the front counters. A few more minutes passed before there's another beep in the headset, but when I got to the computer and asked what they wanted, nobody responded. I asked again and still received no response, so I turned around and looked at the cameras behind me, which were showing live footage of the drive-through line. Strangely, the car drove past the ordering station and came to a stop several feet behind the window. I was standing there. I took a closer look and recognized the car as the man from just a few minutes ago. At this point, I was becoming nervous, so I moved away from the window and stood around the corner. I was out of sight from the window, but I could still see the video. From the camera, I couldn't tell what the guy in the car was doing, but I could see movement. A minute later, the grainy video shows him pulling up quickly and banging on the window. I was startled, but after a few moments he accelerates out of the driveway, through lane, and parks directly in front of the front door. The driver's door swings open, and the man emerges holding something in his hand as he quickly approaches the front door. I grabbed the store phone and dialed 911 as the man aggressively shook the handles, attempting to force the locked doors open. Fortunately, he gave up after a few attempts and ran back to his car, driving away. When the police arrived, they checked to see if I was okay, and I explained what had happened. According to what I heard, they returned in the morning to speak with my manager and collect the camera footage so that they could get a license plate. I wasn't kept up to date on the situation after that, so I'm not sure. Was caught. I've always assumed the man was attempting a robbery, but there's no way of knowing for certain. Sure, being alone that night made me a vulnerable target. Even if many terrible things had occurred, no one would have been present to witness them. Help me. I worked at a 24-hour fast food restaurant a few years ago while in college. The job was not fun or enjoyable in any way, and the majority of my coworkers were middle-aged people with no personality. I was doing school online, which gave me more time to work, so I was putting in at least 40 hours per week and even got promoted to shift lead after a few months. When I accepted the promotion, I had no idea that I was signing up to become a full-time employee, which meant that they could force me to work any shift, even if I was only a week in. They put me up overnight, and I couldn't argue. Overnights were a pain because I was always the only one there. So, if the drive-thru was backed up, then I'd be hustling non-stop without taking breaks. On the other hand, sometimes it would be completely dead, and I'd be standing around all night with my phone. This was one of those nights when I was sitting on a pile of boxes in the back of the kitchen, scrolling through my phone, trying to pass the time, when my headset rang to alert me that a customer had arrived at the drive-thru. I got up, went to the computer, and asked what they would do. I like to order. Nobody said anything, so I turned and looked up at the drive-thru camera, which showed an empty lane. There are no cars in the drive-thru or parking lots surrounding the restaurant. However, the system never falsely beeps like that. There was a slight storm outside, so I assumed it was a raindrop or a flash of light. You must have triggered the sensor somehow. I stayed by the drive-thru window for a few minutes before my headset beeped again. This time, I quickly checked the cameras and saw a man walking past the drive-thru lane. He was dressed in a thick hoodie and a face covering, but he quickly walked out of the camera's view. He couldn't have parked or walked anywhere else near the restaurant unless he walked on the side of the main road. I checked the cameras to see if he'd return, but after 10 minutes of nothing, I went back to my phone. I waited 15 minutes before getting another beat, and when I checked the cameras, I saw the same man, but this time he was standing in the drive-thru. "Lane, can I assist you, sir?" After a moment, he began to recite an order for a small meal. I was not supposed to serve people in the drive-thru unless they were in a vehicle, so I told him I couldn't take his order. He stood there, letting the rain soak him while staring at the screen and not speaking. I considered telling him to leave, but I didn't want to escalate the situation if it wasn't necessary, so I waited. After a minute, he began walking down the drive-thru lane toward the restaurant's window. I rushed over and closed the window, and the man appeared outside in an instant. He was still wearing his hood and mask, but he appeared to be in his late 40s, with long black hair and dead eyes. He watched me through the window and stood outside, as if waiting for me to speak to him. Something about his expression terrified me and prevented me from speaking. Then he softly said, "Open." I nervously replied no, and Justice remained where I was as the man continued to look at me. He asked again and knocked on the window, but after a few seconds he turned and walked away, leaving a loud scraping sound along the side of the building. I checked the cameras to make sure he left, and thankfully he did not return. During the next hour of my shift, however, I kept thinking about that scraping sound. I decided to take the trash to the dumpster and have a quick look. A long scratch on the side of the wall, under the drive-thru window, appeared to be caused by dragging a knife along the building. I called the cops, but the man couldn't be identified from the grainy camera footage, which was masked by the heavy rain and fog. The man never showed up, and I'll never know what he planned to do that night. But given that he was holding a knife, I assumed that if I had followed his orders and opened that window, it would have been the last thing I ever did. I was doing DoorDash late one night to earn some extra cash for savings. It wasn't too busy, but I was getting a few orders here and there, which made it worthwhile. A little after 1 a.m., an order arrived for a customer 30 minutes away. It was a long drive, but the compensation was sufficient for me to accept it. I drove to the restaurant, a local Korean establishment that appeared to be expensive, and then began my journey home. By the end of the route, it was taking me through a bad part of town. I'd been here before and had no problems, but as I drove through and saw all the dilapidated houses, I became uncomfortable. When I arrived at the address, I parked along the side of the road. The house was very small and old, with a cracked and destroyed driveway. I got out of my car and started walking up to the porch, carrying the bag. My phone rang just as I was about to set the bag down. I said hello but received no response, so I hung up and quickly completed the delivery before hurrying back to my car. As I started my car and buckled up, I heard the front door of the house swing open. I looked over and saw a woman waving her arms in the air and running toward my car, screaming for me to wait. It was extremely bizarre. I was too frozen to respond. She dashed up to my window and banged on it, pleading with me to help her. I still had no idea what was going on, so I opened the window slightly and asked what she needed. She told me that her 3-year-old daughter was inside, struggling to breathe, and that I needed to help her. The woman began walking back up the driveway, pleading with me to come help her. Still in shock, I got out of my car and began to follow her, but as I did so, I noticed her becoming quieter and less panicked. I began to think more clearly now that the situation was less chaotic and unexpected, realizing how unusual this was. "Have you called 911 yet?" I inquired, stopping in the driveway. When she turned around, her tears and panic seemed to have disappeared. She stated that there was no time and resumed her obvious panic. It seemed more like a performance than genuine distress. I dashed back to my car as she screamed, even running down the driveway to try to open the passenger door. I restarted the car and reversed as she attempted to run in front of it to get to my side. Once I was clear, I put it in drive and drove around her. And the second I passed the house again, I noticed a large figure standing in the upstairs window, watching everything. As soon as I left the neighborhood, I called 911 and reported the address and situation. When I received a call back from the police, they informed me that the woman had a different story, claiming she had only come out to give me a cash tip. They also mentioned that she lived alone, with no record of any children or adults living with her. This only added to my horror at the situation, but after speaking with the officer again, it became clear that nothing could be done. There was no evidence to support either of our claims, and attempting to press charges would be pointless. Furthermore, the officer appeared tired and uninterested in dealing with anything, but I knew he was correct about my inability to do much, so it was left at that. In my gut, I knew she was trying to get me inside the house for sinister reasons, especially since she didn't have any children. What is the scariest part? After knowing everything, it was strange to see that person inside the house watching us and waiting for me to enter.